busing by race anymore is because the court basically said, don't worry, we've fixed segregation. The quote from the decision is that previous policies have already eliminated, to the extent practicable, the vestiges of past discrimination in the traditional areas of school operation. So it said, no big deal, schools are fine, no problems with segregation, nothing to see here. The Supreme Court, so this was a district court decision, the Supreme Court declined to hear the case. And what that meant is that mandatory busing was essentially ended in the United States. There are still some voluntary programs, but mandatory busing as a means of eliminating segregated schools was no longer an appropriate tool to use in the fight to end segregated schools, and with predictable results, right? Many school areas have become dramatically more segregated in the last 20 years, and they weren't that great to begin with in the 90s because of ending of these policies. 2001, we're like almost to your lifetime. Some of you maybe were alive in 2001. We're getting there. No Child Left Behind, NCLB. No Child Left Behind. This was huge. You will probably have heard of this, even if you don't totally know what it did. And even if you haven't heard from it, it still affects your school situation. This was an amendment to the ESEA. And it said public schools that get federal money have to establish standardized statewide tests. So if you get federal money, you have to take statewide standardized tests. So remember, Clinton said, hey, if you're interested in standardizing your curriculum, here's some money to do it. No Child Left Behind took that sort of scooshy optional version and made it much harder. It said, no, now if you get our money, you have to do this. States get to choose what's on the test, but an increasing percentage of students must pass the tests each year, which is called adequate yearly progress. More students must pass each year. And in fact, in No Child Left Behind in 2001, they said by 2014, 100% of American public school students must pass the tests in their state. 100%. You must have a perfect passing rate in all states. Hint, that didn't happen. One of the interesting things about No Child Left Behind was that No Child Left Behind broke down those results by race and income and language and disability status, which meant for the first time that schools that were doing really well with some subgroups of people, but not doing a good job of educating other subgroups of people, could no longer hide, right? So if you had a school that was doing, like had 90% of people passing your tests, but no English language learners passed your test, no longer could you be like, 90%, that's great, we got an A. All of a sudden you're getting an A among non-English language learners, but you're getting an F in English language learners. So that was a positive effect in terms of the federal government looking out for people in subgroups. But if you tell a school and you tell a state that an increasing percentage of people must pass a test every single year, what do states do as a result? Yes, they do two things. They cheat, okay? Who's from Atlanta? You've heard of the Atlanta cheating scandal? Yeah, it was bad. Teachers were like filling out tests for students. It turns out teachers are pretty good at filling out tests for students. Students, not so much, but the third graders, they just like got brilliant in Atlanta all of a sudden because, you know, filling out the test for them. Did you have a question?
No, I was going to say that here in Michigan, that was huge. Cheating was everywhere back in like 2000.
Yeah, really big deal. What is the other thing that states have an incentive to do? So they might just cheat. But if you have a state that has to establish a test and then they say that everyone has to pass that test in increasing amounts, what is the state probably going to do for that test? Yeah.
Only accept certain students.
So they have to accept all students. So they're going to do something else, yeah. Make it super easy. Make it super easy. If I was told, if Casey told me, that at the end of the topic lecture, all of you had to take a test, okay? And if 100% of you did not pass the test, I was immediately fired. And I have to just like pack myself up, pack up my dog, and head back to Atlanta this afternoon, okay? But Casey also says, Maggie, you get to write the test. Okay, so you get to write this test. But 100% of the people who attended your topic lecture this morning have to pass or you're fired. How hard is the test going to be? Am I going to ask like challenging questions about the Charlotte-Mecklenburg busing decisions, or am I going to be like, what's the topic this year? Is it education or something else? And you'll all fill in the education bubble, and then congratulations, I continue to be employed at Spark Debate Institute, right? So that's basically what states did. They watered down their tests, and they cheated. And they only taught students that were right around the passing level. If you were super smart and you were going to pass the test anyway, you didn't get a lot of teaching because There was no incentive to teach you. And if you were so far behind that it was going to be really, really, really challenging to get you to pass, they didn't teach you either. Schools that did not meet their adequate yearly progress were supposed to be closed or turned over to charters. Or another fun one where you fire everyone at the school and then just like keep this name of the school but start over with an entirely like new principal, new everyone, all new teachers. And that was what it was sort of supposed to happen. Okay, 2009 comes along, we got Obama. Race to the top, R2T or RTTT. I like R2T, like R number 2T. Race to the top, we're racing and we're going to the top. We're not racing down, we're racing up, okay? Top. Another one of these fun ones, right? Like no child left behind, as if somebody's going to be like, no, let's leave a couple of the kids behind. It's really hard to argue against things that the name sounds so promising, right? Race to the top. All right, this was a $4.35 billion, with a B, billion-dollar competitive grant program under Obama's Department of Education. It was funded under the stimulus package. So right after Obama came to office, economy not doing so well. There was a big stimulus package. If you got better roads right around 2010, 2011, 2012, that's the stimulus. I was driving through New Hampshire that year, and it seemed like every single highway was under construction, and that was all stimulus money. But as part of the stimulus, there was a competitive grant program where states got to apply to get some extra federal money. And to get the money, they had to sort of produce a plan for how they were going to improve education. And they got points for things like eliminating laws that prohibited charters, so allowing charter schools, increasing their use of data, adopting common standards through sort of Common Core. Yeah, love it. You heard Trump complaining about Common Core at the beginning. Race to the Top didn't say you had to have Common Core, but it did say you had to have some common standards, and Common Core was like the easiest one to sign on to. And also doing performance-based evaluations of teachers and principals. And what that means is that no longer is it just that the principal comes in and sort of looks at the class and sees how it's going. Instead, the principal has your teacher's evaluation also depend on students' performance on tests. 46 states applied for the grants, and most of them changed their laws to be more in line with those things. 19 states got some amount of money. The largest was $700 million. A lot of money. Two was $700 million. 19 states got something. All right, 2015, ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act, and it's pronounced ESSA, okay? So if you heard someone talking about ESSA, or if you see this in your cards, you should just say it. You say it as a word. So anyone in education, they're talking about the ESSA. ESSA was a, wait for it, a reauthorization of the ESEA. So the ESSA is a reauthorization of the ESEA because we love acronyms, and education and ACT are common words. This is the thing that replaced No Child Left Behind. So you heard a lot about No Child Left Behind. I'll be honest, I had heard a lot less about ESSA, and I'm a teacher. When No Child Left Behind happened, it was like really dramatically changed the landscape for schools. ESSA, not so much, and the reason for that is that this is the first law to decrease the federal role in education since the 1970s. So this is the first time Congress said, ooh, we're going to take a step back. We are going to decrease the federal role in education. And what it said is that No Child Left Behind required states to have tests, administer those tests, determine, and then the federal government said what percentage of people had to meet, and the federal government decided what happened to schools if they didn't meet their adequate yearly progress. What ESSA said is that we're going to shift the accountability for standardized testing from the federal government to the states. And so states can now themselves determine what the consequences are for schools that have low test scores. Prior to that, remember, I told you that 100% of schools were supposed to be meeting, 100% of students in 100% of schools were supposed to be passing tests by 2014. ESSA sort of said, you know, that's not really what's happening. And the Obama administration had been granting waivers for schools that had improved but were not meeting 100% of students, and this sort of eliminated those waivers by saying, states, you get to decide now. Trump education policy. Trump education policy. So, on the campaign trail, Trump said two major things about education. He said we should eliminate the Department of Education. Seems like that's not going to happen. He also said that we should divert $20 billion, again with a B, billion, dollars in federal money toward private school vouchers. What's a voucher? You got a voucher. Yeah, what do you got?
Me?
Yep.
So states give certain students who apply for them money, and they can use the voucher at any school. So a lot of kids then end up going to like good private schools, and they'll use their voucher, and that means the state pays X amount of dollars to the private school for the tuition.
Absolutely, that was exactly right. And federal government, Trump said the federal government should divert $20 billion toward vouchers. And what he just told us is that what it is that instead of you just going to your local public school, or if you wanted to go to a private school, your family would have to pay the full cost of that private school. Instead, it would be government money given to you, like you get a check that can only be used for education, a voucher, right, that can only be used for education, and saying you get to pick the school. And what that means, in effect, is that many students would start going to independent schools, or in particular parochial schools, with federal money. He called school choice. So if you are in favor of these policies, you tend to call them choice, because choice, it's like, how can you disagree with giving people choices, right? So school choice, Trump called school choice the civil rights issue of our time. So the civil rights issue of our time is that you don't get to decide what school you go to. He also ordered a review of Department of Education policies to make sure that they don't overstep federal control, because he wants to push a bunch of stuff back toward the states. And that review is going to be done in November or December. And he really hates Common Core. It's sort of unclear what he thinks should be done with it, but he talks about that a lot. All right. Oops. I thought I had a slide on it. Betsy DeVos, our Secretary of Education, from the great, great state of Michigan. Betsy DeVos is our Secretary of Education. She's from Michigan, Holland, Michigan. Anyone here from Holland? My mom's family's from Holland. Okay. The family net worth of Betsy DeVos's family is worth $5.6 billion. And the DeVos family and the Prince family, which is what she was before she was a DeVos, is a huge donor to GOP causes, especially Christian-focused GOP causes. Fun fact of the morning, Betsy DeVos's father invented the lighted sun visor. So if you, in your car, flip down the sun visor and a little light comes on, you got Mr. Prince to thank for that, Betsy DeVos's father. Her brother founded the private military contractor Blackwater, which was very involved in the Iraq War. And this is her first job in public schooling. Her kids went to private Christian schools in Holland. And this is sort of her first public education job. She is very anti-tax and very anti-regulation. And she is a huge advocate of school choice. So remember way back, almost an hour ago now, when I said that it seemed like we were going to have more charter schools under the Trump administration. This is where that's coming from, that she thinks charter schools are great. And more than that, she thinks vouchers are great, that kids should be getting money from the government to go to any school that they want. Part of that is that she thinks that religious schools are sort of a return to the original education model. So before 1815, you were not required to go to school, and schools were mostly run by churches. And so she thinks that sort of that is part of the return to the historical role in education. So the federal government should not be very involved in education, that when you force kids to go to public schools, that takes away from the family's right to educate their kids how they see fit. So her goal seems to be to increase the use of federal money to have students attend non-public schools, and in other ways to decrease the federal role in education. So the federal government would probably be spending a little less money. There will be a lot less rules if she has her way, and there will be more kids who are using federal money to go to non-public schools. And that's sort of where we're at on Betsy DeVos. Yeah?
In order to get funding for private education, isn't there like the limit test or something like that that you have to follow?
Yes, there's a lot of details, and there's actually a Supreme Court case that we got to see announced when we were in DC a couple weeks ago that plays into this. But there's sort of a lot of policies, and it's a little bit still being worked out how constitutional it is, some of these particular voucher policies. What the Supreme Court has mostly held is that if the family gets money and then the family makes the choice to use that money for religious school education, that is not violating sort of the separation of church and state, because it is not the federal government funding that school directly. It is the federal government giving the money to an intermediary that then decides to send their kids to that school. But some of this is still evolving. Some areas like Washington, D.C. have vouchers where kids can go to parochial schools. Some have vouchers that are a little bit more limited. And so sort of figuring out where this is going in the next 4 or 8 years is going to be an interesting thing that we're talking about. Yeah, what other questions? Yeah?
So vouchers are not restricted to parochial schools or for like...
No, they can go to any independent school. A lot of areas, the parochial schools are less expensive than other independent schools because they get some funding from their religious organization, and so a lot of vouchers, a disproportionate percentage of vouchers do go to parochial schools because they tend to be given to people who otherwise could not afford to go to private school, and sort of makes that school affordable. But yeah, you can go to any independent school. Yeah?
How does homeschooling fit into the definition of education, which says that the curriculum or instruction which occurs in the school?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So from a federal sort of perspective or a legal perspective, homeschools do count as schools. And most of the homeschooling litigation has been about, like, is compulsory school education, so forcing people to go to schools, constitutional? And what they've determined is that forcing people to participate in the educational process is definitely constitutional, but you can't force it to happen at a public school or even in a school itself. And there are a lot of homeschooling organizations that spring up that are legally justified. The other sort of area of homeschooling that's been really heavily litigated is whether kids can be homeschooled for most of school but still participate in the band or still play football or still be in the school play. And for the most part, the court has determined that yes, even if you don't participate in all of the school things, you still have the right, because you are entitled, because you get to go to a public school. If you are otherwise able to go to that public school, you can still participate in those things for homeschool. But good question. The topic certainly does not say public schools, so I think homeschools are included. It would not surprise me if there are some definitions of education that would say school is not include homeschooling, but most of the ones that I've seen just sort of say in schools, and I think legally that would be included. Yeah?
For property tax funding,
Yep.
or property tax funding, does it have to do with company property tax or residential?
Both. So if you live in an area where there's an extremely wealthy business that has a giant factory that's worth a lot of money, they pay property taxes and your school's probably pretty good. But what happens is that neighborhoods will all fall at the same time, right? So if a local area, like if that, say, factory shuts down, simultaneously you're not getting that public tax money from the factory, and all the people that worked at the factory who live in that neighborhood all lose their jobs. And so you will have areas where the property tax dramatically goes down all at once in ways that really affect local schools. Good question. Other questions? Yeah?
So does that hurt the funding?
Yes, very much. Some of that, the federal government gets involved. So, right, we talked about how Title I means that areas that have a lot of kids living in poverty will be compensated, but a lot of times no. Yeah?
Are
it's not enough.
GEDs included in a topic?
Oh, that's interesting. So his question is a GED, or a generalized education degree, meaning non-high school. So if you do not graduate from high school, you can get a GED, which means that you demonstrate that you sort of learned the things that you would have learned in high school in order to go to college. And I had not thought about it. I think probably yes, but maybe doesn't meet some of the more strict understandings of education in the same way there'd be a question about homeschooling. Whether that takes place in a school because you're just sort of going to take a test, I'm not sure. Certainly it's the right age range, right? Because it's before college. But I'm not sure. I will do some investigating. Any other questions? Awesome. Thank you for the privilege of teaching you this morning. We will take about a 5-minute break. We'll take about a 5-minute break, and then Will's going to pick up to talk to you about the package.